Okay, very good
Se me
morning. Buenos dias a todos. A warm welcome to all the distinguished panelists and participants. This is the second in the series on TRIPS waivers focused on Latin America and the Caribbean region, after the last one was held on Africa last Saturday. We at RIS are very glad to organize this series of webinars with the South Center as our partner. The need for vaccines is urgent, especially in the developing world where vaccination levels are very low. There is the increasing threat from new strains of SARS-CoV-2, especially the Delta variant, which is spreading very rapidly and is becoming dominant in the world. More variants such as Lambda seem to have appeared in Latin America recently. Recent data suggests that partial vaccination is ineffective and that full vaccination with 2 doses or even more may be necessary to protect against the new variants. Therefore, we need to remove all barriers to rapid vaccine production and provide affordable access to them. The TRIPS waiver is a necessary but not sufficient requirement for this. Production and technology transfer must be stepped up rapidly across the world, especially in developing countries. The great challenge is to meet stringent quality standards for vaccines manufactured in developing countries. We expect the COVID challenge to remain with us in future, with the need to modify and adapt the vaccines to meet new variants. Hence, the TRIPS waiver proposal at WTO assumes great importance. It is a test of the political will of the international community to respond to the needs of the most needy in the world. We also need to step up and speed up the development and deployment of vaccines to meet future challenges and apply new technologies such as rapid genomic sequencing and precision editing and mRNA technology, which could be of help. The IPRs associated with these technologies would also need to be made accessible and affordable in future. So with these opening introductory remarks, I would like to invite Professor Carlos Correa to make his remarks before going on to hand over the chair of the session to Mr. André de Mello to conduct the proceedings. So over to you, Professor Correa.
Gracias, muchas gracias por moderar esta sesión. Nuevamente quiero expresar la satisfacción del Centro Sur por organizar este seminario como parte de una serie de seminarios sobre el waiver con RIS, uno de los think tanks más importantes de los países en desarrollo. Quiero agradecer muy particularmente a nuestros panelistas que un día sábado nos acompañan para examinar esta importante cuestión del waiver que se está discutiendo actualmente en el marco de la Organización Mundial de Comercio. Solamente algunos comentarios preliminares. El primero es que América Latina, como sabemos, los latinoamericanos, ha sufrido este problema de la equidad en el acceso a vacunas. Digamos, es una región que ha sido muy fuertemente afectada por esta problemática, con excepción de algún país de la región, como es el caso de Chile. Ha habido un notable retraso en la administración de las vacunas, lo que ha producido sufrimiento, lo que ha producido decesos que podrían haberse impedido. Esto es en parte consecuencia de que COVAX no cumplió con las expectativas que se habían puesto en este mecanismo, porque como sabemos los países desarrollados acapararon en exceso las vacunas que necesitaban y esto condujo a que COVAX no pudiera cumplir con los objetivos que se habían planteado, así como la situación que se creó como resultado de las demandas de algunas empresas proveedoras de vacunas en relación con garantías inaceptables para los gobiernos en términos de su responsabilidad en casos de negligencia o en casos de problemas que pudieran ocasionarse con la administración de las vacunas. La región se benefició, sin embargo, de la oferta de proveedores de la China y de Rusia. La buena noticia es que en algunos países de América Latina se ha comenzado la producción o el llamado fill and finish de vacunas para el COVID-19 y también el hecho de que en Cuba se hayan desarrollado vacunas. Se agradezco en particular la participación de la doctora Mauri en este evento que puede darnos entonces una vacuna originada en la región para afrontar las consecuencias tan graves de esta situación. El segundo comentario tiene que ver más específicamente con la discusión del waiver. Como ustedes saben, se da inicio a las llamadas discusiones basadas en texto. Ahora, incluyendo también una propuesta de la Unión Europea, que desde nuestro punto de vista no es una propuesta productiva. Médicos Sin Fronteras ha hecho un análisis breve pero interesante de esta propuesta de la Unión Europea. Será importante que los panelistas, si tienen la oportunidad, se refieran a los 3 puntos que la Unión Europea propone abordar en relación con el artículo 31 bis del acuerdo TRIPS, que desde nuestro punto de vista no proveen una solución adecuada. Más bien dar una señal en el sentido de que es necesario reformar este artículo 31 bis que impone condiciones tan severas e injustificadas para la operación de licencias obligatorias en favor de los países que no tienen capacidad manufacturera, su capacidad manufacturera es insuficiente. El tema es entonces cómo brindar mayor apoyo a nuestros países y diplomáticos para que el waiver siga adelante. Agradezco nuevamente entonces a los panelistas, a los participantes y les deseo una muy fructífera discusión. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Professor Correa. Now I would like to hand over the proceedings to Mr.André de Mello for conducting the meeting from now on. Over to you, Professor André.
Você está mutado, André. Você está sem áudio.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are at the globe. Let me start out by commending RIS and the South Center for this very timely initiative. Let me just briefly try to set the stage for our discussions today before handing out the floor to our distinguished panelists. As you know, the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement enables members to waive an obligation in exceptional circumstances, such as the one that we are now going through. And this is done by consensus-based decision-making. And in the past, it has already been successfully carried out, for instance, to waive specific articles of the TRIPS agreement with respect to pharmaceutical products in least developed countries. As of now, we have 60 WTO member countries supporting the proposal. And now turning particularly to Latin America, Brazil is the only country in the region to oppose the waiver. It is the only developing country to oppose the waiver, which is a position that goes against the historic and traditional position of Brazil in negotiations regarding global intellectual property norms. The position of Brazil, for instance, in the negotiations of the Uruguay round of the TRIPS agreement were very different and were much more aligned with the position of India, one of the main proponents of the waiver. The same can be said about the position of Brazil with respect to the Doha Declaration, and particularly paragraph 4, which reflects almost exactly the writing that was proposed by the country. And this reflects at the time an alignment with the Trump administration, but as of now, even the US has shifted in its position, and under Biden, it has also began to support the waiver. Now, as has already been said, Latin America is suffering tremendously from the COVID-19 pandemic. It actually has become the epicenter of the pandemic. It has, as of now, the highest death rate in the world, and this refers to June. It accounts for only 8% of the world population, but unfortunately, 1/3 of the deaths from COVID is taking place in the region. Professor Carlos Correa already spoke about the lack of vaccines. Less than 10% of Latin Americans have received the first dose of a vaccine against COVID-19 as of now, according to the Pan American Health Organization. And the waiver proposal is also particularly relevant for the region, for Latin America, not just because of the severity of the pandemic here, but also because larger Latin American countries have significant vaccine and pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities. Brazil, Argentina, Cuba, and Mexico all have manufacturing units capable of producing vaccines. As we speak, the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, which is a foundation of the health ministry in Brazil, is building Latin America's largest vaccine factory. So as the argument goes, we need the waiver to expand the supply, not just of vaccines, but other pharmaceutical goods necessary to fight the pandemic. But we also know that this expansion of supply, even with the waiver, cannot take place in the short term. It will involve some sort of technology transfer, especially for the new technologies that were already mentioned of the most recent vaccines, mRNA. And it may also involve some reverse engineering practices, such as we carried out here in Brazil with antiretroviral drugs used to fight the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So another issue that comes up is, even if the waiver cannot supply in the short term the needed vaccines and other goods, can it also serve to promote more structural long-term changes in the global intellectual property system? And with that, let me, with no further ado, introduce our distinguished panelists. And following the order here, Mr. Felipe Carvalho represents Doctors Without Borders. As you know, a transnational non-governmental organization has been very active in the campaign for essential medicines and also in debates regarding intellectual property and health. We have Professor Oscar Lizarazo-Cortés from the National University of Colombia, which adds to the diversity of our panel. We also have Dr.Mayda Mauri, Vice President, BioCuba Pharma, Havana, and we all know the prominent role that Cuba plays in supplying vaccines and pharmaceuticals and in healthcare in general in the region. My colleague, Dr.Henrique Zeferino de Menezes, is Associate Professor at the Federal University of Paraiba, Brazil. Pleasure to see you here again. We have worked on some projects together in the past. And last but not least, Ms. Viviana Muñoz Tellez. She's a Ph.D. coordinator of the Health, Intellectual Property, and Biodiversity Program of the South Center. So I would ask each panelist to speak from 10 to 15 minutes, but no longer than 15 minutes, so that we have time for questions and answers and some debate in the end as well. So with that, let me give the floor to Felipe. Felipe, again, thanks for joining us. We're delighted to have you here. And I know it was short notice, and I also know you have other commitments today. But I believe your contribution is very valuable to our panel. And please, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, André. Thanks a lot, everybody, for organizing such an important discussion. I'm happy to participate and contribute. So from MSF perspective, working not only here in Brazil, but also more broadly in the region, I would like to make some comments about the state of play of the position that the countries from the region have taken so far in the waiver discussion and negotiation. First of all, I think we need to acknowledge a historical perspective, considering that the TRIPS agreement itself was not exactly a desire by developing countries. It was rather imposed by countries from the north and their pharmaceutical companies. And it was something that developing countries had to accept. And some of them, including like Brazil, before the TRIPS agreement, were not actually allowing patenting of pharmaceutical products and other essential goods. So this was a process that has led to many negotiations, but it's important to remember that developing countries have tried to create some space for public health during different rounds of negotiations. And maybe the most successful attempt was around the Doha Declaration, where developing countries, including many countries from Latin America, have played a role to secure a declaration that considered health should be prioritized over any other commerce impositions. So from that perspective, we have noticed that countries from Latin America over the past decades, they have been quite aligned and relevant in further clarifying the use of public health safeguards, in pushing for resolutions, and in trying to create additional flexibilities. And that was also because most of those countries, when they tried to use public health related flexibilities, they have faced pressure from other countries, from especially rich countries, and from pharmaceutical companies. So despite the fact that there are flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement, and that there are declarations like the Doha Declaration and many other resolutions that recognize the impacts of intellectual property on health, these countries have been facing over and over again the challenge around the use of the flexibilities. We have numerous examples, but most recently in Colombia, when the attempts to use commissary license for cancer medicines were addressed with strong pressure, contrary pressure from different actors. So it's important to understand that these countries were also impacted by other pandemics and have faced before other access crises around HIV drugs in the beginning of the years 2000s, also access to hepatitis C drugs, cancer drugs. There have been ongoing and repeated access crisis in Latin America. So, and we have in Latin America also a reality in which many people still don't have proper access to healthcare, but at the same time, also many countries have public health systems and mechanisms to provide universal access to treatment. But these mechanisms have been constantly undermined by high prices and patenting strategies by pharmaceutical companies. So that's the baseline, the reality that we had so far. So these countries have been impacted by intellectual property norms. They have tried to use public health safeguards, and they have faced pressure against the use of these flexibilities. So now when we arrived at the COVID-19 pandemic, would be expected that those countries would be strongly supporting any initiative that would, help to overcome this kind of scenario. And the waiver proposal, when was firstly introduced in October last year, strangely, it didn't got much buy-in from countries from Latin America that were already suffering with lack of supplies for diagnostics, lack of supplies for medical equipment, and that was, of course, in the verge of suffering from lack of access to vaccines. So these countries have not supported immediately the proposal for the waiver. And that's something we are trying to, until today, discuss. And I think this panel is an important contribution, because there are many reasons behind the lack of support from Latin American countries. And one of them may be, of course, again, the pressure from companies and rich countries that the countries in the region are, as the Professor Correa said, many of them rely on COVAX for supply of vaccines, and COVAX has been slow and not sending sufficient quantities. By the end of April, we could notice that most of the countries in the region got less than 10% of what they were supposed to get from COVAX in the first stage of COVAX deliveries, that is finishing now in June. And this situation it's continuing. We are not seeing that COVAX is being able to fill the gaps, and COVAX is now too much reliant on donations and has not been able to make the agreements that it needed to supply the group of countries covered by the mechanism. So this has also put the Latin American governments in a position of they need actually to negotiate bilateral agreements to serve their populations, and these negotiations with companies have been quite hard. There have been some reports of abusive conditions in contracts, especially with companies like Pfizer in their negotiations with Peru, in their negotiations with Brazil. Especially around the indemnity clauses, the jurisdictions that are appointed for resolutions of conflicts, the lack of responsabilization by the company for any adverse events around vaccination or even delays in deliveries. And also countries have been asked to put public national assets as collateral for indemnization. So these tough negotiations also have a component of pressure because the countries in the region, when they are discussing support to the waiver, in the public debate, we can clearly see those associations representing pharmaceutical companies saying about the risk of interrupting supplies or maybe canceling contracts. There are statements about that we can find in Brazil and other countries. So these countries are, of course, under pressure to make sure that they get the vaccines they have paid for. And of course, this can have a spillover effect in their position towards the waiver. But anyway, this is also a historical opportunity for those countries that in the past years have fought so hard to create more space for public health. And now this is a moment where majority of countries at WTO are actually supporting this proposal, including the US. And we can consider that there was last week a statement by the APEC trade ministers that include also Canada, South Korea, Japan, also supporting the waiver. So we would expect that Latin American governments realize this is actually a good opportunity to get rid of this situation of feeling under pressure, because if they join the waiver negotiations, actually they are joining others, including rich countries that are now aligned with this view that intellectual property is indeed a barrier to address this pandemic. And as Professor Correa mentioned, maybe as we are moving to tax-based negotiations now, the major concern relies on the position of the European Union that has kind of made an alternative proposal that is also on the table at WTO, although it's technically speaking, is not really a proposal that brings anything new to the table. We see it more as a distraction to create delays in the negotiation of the waiver. But anyway, the European Union has approached different countries to try to build support to their proposal, including Brazil and Chile. They have there are reports that the European Union was trying to get also buy-in from some of these countries from the region, and we have also pushed back against that as MSF, and at least Brazil has rejected to be a sponsor of the European Union proposal, which is a good step. And more recently, Brazil also declared in one of the WTO meetings that it's ready to support the waiver negotiation. It was the first time that Brazil said such kind of more clear positioning in favor of the waiver, because before Brazil was rather positioning against or kind of open to discuss, which is a position that doesn't say much. But more recently, Brazil finally had a more strong statement in favor of the waiver, And we hope that Brazil, during the tax-based negotiations, will contribute to a comprehensive waiver, because now also there is the risk of a reduction in the scope of the proposal. The original proposal, let us remember, it covers not only vaccines, but also treatments, diagnostics, and every relevant medical good that is needed to address the pandemic. And also covers all intellectual property rights that may create any sort of barrier. So it goes beyond patents and includes trade secrets, copyrights, industrial designs, every kind of intellectual property that can block competition and can block new developers to enter in the market. So we are yet to see how Brazil will behave in the negotiations. But there are other countries in the region that are still in this open to discuss position, and it's not clear whether they are declaring support to the waiver or not until this stage. So one of the things that MSF has been focusing on is really to campaign in the region. We had a specific campaign in Brazil to try to push Brazil to change its position, but also regionally we have a petition also calling governments from Latin America to support the waiver, to stick to their historical contribution to public health debates by defending this proposal. And lastly, I think as others will probably focus more than me, there is an important component of local production capacity in the region that needs to be stimulated and also used where it already exists, but also stimulated where it can start to be developed. So this is a very important feature that countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina already have some expertise, but other countries can also engage in this field. And also, of course, we are quite excited to see also a vaccine being developed in Cuba that can be a game changer in the region once it gets approved. And in terms of quality standards, it's important to also notice that Latin American regulatory agencies have been classified as high quality authorities. Some of the regulatory agencies are already referenced regional authorities according to the Pan American Health Organization. Some of them are also being evaluated by the new WHO system of qualification in a very high position. So the region has the conditions to become also a hub of production. But of course, there is the intellectual property barrier to be overcome for that to happen, including for the mRNA technology. We believe with proper access to the trade secrets and the industrial information and also the information protected by patents, different countries can maybe start projects and start investments and create networks of collaborations with companies in India, in Thailand, in China that are already more advanced in the mRNA technology. But for all that to happen, we need really the waiver to come true. And this is what we need to create the proper space for collaborations that are not happening today, and then will for sure create more sustainable local production environment for all countries across the region and across developing countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Felipe. Very comprehensive presentation, and I think it was particularly important the way you highlighted the value of the waiver proposal, given the insufficiency of the options that are already there for developing countries, and particularly for Latin America. And Professor Carlos Correa has also hinted at this. So the waiver brings advantages that we don't have as of yet, given the flexibilities of TRIPS, the COVAX initiative, and other options that are there. And thank you also for updating us with regard both to the EU proposal and to the position of Brazil. Let me remind participants that we have for this session a translation to Spanish, and you can use it if you like. I think you have to press this blue button at the bottom left corner of your screen. And without further ado, let me give the floor to Professor Lizarazo, Lizarazo, forgive me, from Colombia. Professor, you have the floor to enlighten us on the Colombian perspective of this debate. Thank you for joining us. And I believe you have a presentation, no? Professor, can you hear me? Are you muted? Let me see. You're muted, Professor.
Let me. No, now you can. ¿Pueden escucharme?
Te escuchamos.
Gracias.
Sí, bueno,
Listo. Listo, gracias. Decía que voy a hacer la presentación, voy a hablar en español, pero las diapositivas están en inglés. Un eje de la pregunta de la presentación es por qué algunos países pueden fabricar vacunas y otros no, que digamos que está estrictamente ligado con el waiver. Una de las hipótesis es que los países de la región que pueden fabricar vacunas, Argentina, México, Cuba, Brasil, lo pueden hacer en parte por mayor inversión en ciencia y tecnología, por mayor tradición científica, pero también porque tienen criterios más estrictos de patentabilidad. Eso les ha dado freedom to operate o libertad de operación, les ha permitido aprender, crear capacidades locales, no solo en el último año, sino en los últimos 10, 20 o 30 años. O sea, hay una capacidad acumulada, una libertad de operación acumulada. Y el efecto del waiver podría ser similar para otros países, crear seguridad jurídica y crear libertad de operación, ¿no? Por eso, así a veces no me refiero específicamente al waiver, pues es un asunto que está íntimamente ligado. Me parece importante decir, muchos de los críticos dicen, ¿por qué un waiver, que es una medida un poco obligatoria, aunque los países la adoptarían por consenso, por qué no medidas voluntarias? Y no sobra recordar que los países ya han insistido bastante antes del waiver, paralelamente y después en medidas voluntarias, e infortunadamente los titulares de las patentes no han querido sumarse a esas iniciativas. Una de las principales es el Patent Pool, el COVID Technology Access Pool de mayo de 2020, apoyado por 40 países, impulsado por Costa Rica, Chile y la Organización Mundial de la Salud. Parece que ninguna empresa farmacéutica se ha sumado, bueno, salvo una recientemente, a ese patent pool, que en el fondo sería una especie de pool de licencias voluntarias. Hay una iniciativa de unos académicos de Estados Unidos, el Open COVID Pledge. Ninguna empresa farmacéutica se sumó, se sumaron algunas empresas de tecnología cuando se creía que las aplicaciones podrían jugar un rol más importante en la trazabilidad y demás. Han habido intentos de licencias obligatorias de Teva de Israel, de Biolis de Canadá, de Bavaria Nordic, de Dinamarca, de Incepta de Bangladesh, que le han dicho a los titulares: tengo capacidad, si usted me da una licencia voluntaria, yo puedo ayudar a fabricar dosis para satisfacer la demanda mundial. Y a pesar de no dar abasto, de no alcanzar a satisfacer la producción, los titulares de las patentes y de los secretos empresariales se han negado a dar licencias voluntarias. Y es por eso que surge... ¿Aló? ¿Sí?
Sí, hola, soy intérprete de español a inglés. ¿Usted podría retomar la presentación? Porque me acabo de conectar, me había desconectado, y así puedo traducir a todos los panelistas.
Listo. Pues voy a seguir por razones del tiempo.
Vale.
Solo me quedan 10 minutos. Sí.
Listo. Vale, pero intentar hacer una frase o dos y así las voy traduciendo.
Listo.
Porque si no, no se enteran de nada.
Sí. Decía que ante la negativa de ese apoyo a las licencias voluntarias es que surge el waiver. Y eso es lo que explica el waiver, porque una de las críticas es ¿por qué no insisten o por qué no proponen licencias voluntarias? Ya se ha propuesto, ya se ha insistido, Ahí están los datos en la diapositiva.
So the idea is that there was this opposition to compulsory waivers and that's to compulsory licenses, and that's why at the end of the day we are asking for waivers, and there is available data to support the compulsory licensing. Sigue.
Sí, gracias. La otra idea o el otro mito es que quien generó las vacunas supuestamente fue el sector privado y fueron las empresas farmacéuticas, por lo tanto hay que darles monopolios temporales a través de patentes y secretos empresariales, pero se olvida que además de recursos privados, que ciertamente los hubo, mucha de la investigación es de recursos públicos, e igual esos pioneros no alcanzan a abastecer o a satisfacer la demanda mundial. Pfizer, AstraZeneca y otros le han cumplido entrega de dosis de vacunas incluso de la Unión Europea.
So the
Por
other,
eso se necesita.
disculpa. Entonces, the other idea is that, of course, the private sector is behind most of the manufacturing and production of the vaccines, and there are lots of private money involved in this production. But we also know that there is public money that was spent in terms of general investigation and research in the vaccines program. So we can understand that in transitionary period, these companies, big pharma companies, should benefit from some kind of protection for a while. But we also know that these private companies have not been able to cover the world demand, and we know that there is lots of lack of vaccines everywhere.
Sí, sí, gracias. Le pediría un favor al traductor de pronto. Voy a tratar de ser más concreto. De pronto solo hacer una frase más corta porque solo me quedan 8 minutos. Solo me quedan 8 minutos. Y creo que parte de lo que digo pues está sintetizado en las diapositivas. Entonces, por lo tanto, se necesita, para satisfacer esa escasez, ese desabastecimiento, ese acaparamiento mundial, se necesita no solo ver la propiedad intelectual desde el lado de los titulares o los generadores, sino desde una mirada del interés público que tenga en cuenta otras variables, el dominio público, la libertad de operación y la copia legal que en ciertos casos es permitida bajo acuerdos de licencia o simplemente porque hay libertad de operación porque no hay patentes en determinado país, que es lo que aparece ahí en amarillo en la diapositiva. Eso es totalmente diferente, eso es perfectamente legal, es legítimo y es diferente a la falsificación, pues que sí sabemos que no funciona y que engaña a los consumidores. Creo que la idea que resume esto es: para poder satisfacer la demanda mundial de dosis de vacunas, las empresas titulares o las empresas innovadoras no pueden producir todas las dosis necesarias, por eso es necesario que otras empresas puedan entrar a fabricar, y para entrar a fabricar, digamos que entraría esa dimensión de interés público o de dominio público, más bien de la propiedad intelectual, que es lo que está ahí en amarillo, pero creo que pues, la diapositiva lo resume.
So since I do not have so much time, I'm going to summarize quickly, even though I think it's quite clear and synthesized in the on your screen. So what I was saying is that since there's this huge world demand, we should not view intellectual property with the eyes of the right holders. We should rather put to the forth the public interest, the public domain, and also the freedom to trade and to operate. So we should try to come up with some other kind of agreements on licenses. I think all these possibilities are actually legal and of course have nothing to do with falsifying any kind of thing. So once again, the idea is that since all these companies are not able to meet all the world demand, we should help other companies to manufacture the vaccines.
Gracias. Volviendo al eje de mi presentación, porque algunos países pueden hacer vacunas y otros no. Cerca de 15 países pueden fabricar vacunas, entre ellos algunos del sur global como Argentina. Como ya decía, además de mayor tradición científica y tecnológica, por ejemplo, el premio Nobel de César Milstein en el desarrollo de anticuerpos, Argentina es líder en Latinoamérica en producción de farmacéuticos y de biotecnología. Y en parte eso se explica por tener posiblemente la guía de examen de patentes más estricta de toda Latinoamérica. Y eso es lo que permite que Argentina esté fabricando no solo fill and finish, sino está produciendo la sustancia activa de 2 vacunas. La vacuna Oxford-AstraZeneca a través de la empresa Map Science, que pues, hace parte de un grupo empresarial más grande, y la vacuna Gamaleya en un acuerdo entre la empresa Richmond de Argentina y el Instituto de Rusia. Pero la fábrica donde Argentina hace las vacunas Oxford-AstraZeneca no la hicieron este año, sino es una fábrica que les costó $40 millones que originalmente desarrollaron para hacer anticuerpos monoclonales biosimilares o genéricos. Y es gracias a esa capacidad instalada y a esa libertad de operación que Argentina puede producir vacunas y Colombia no. De hecho, la semana pasada llegaron a Colombia 500.000 dosis de vacunas a través de COVAX fabricadas en Argentina. En contraste, Colombia no tiene de momento en el corto plazo capacidad propia de producción de vacunas. Digamos que en resumen, un elemento clave para responder a la pregunta es Argentina tiene criterios estrictos de patentabilidad y eso le ha permitido generar esa capacidad de producción en los últimos 10, 20, 30 años. El waiver podría tener un efecto similar, generar seguridad jurídica y libertad de operación a una escala más global.
So I was saying that there are, of course, countries that are able to produce vaccines and others not. You all know that. And you know that, for example, in Argentina, it's a leading country in South America that has been able already, with a Nobel Prize, by the way, in the production of antibodies. It's a country that does biosimilars, already does manufacture vaccines, and it has a very strict patentability criteria in place, one of the strongest ones in Latin America. And you know that Argentina is participating in the production of the active substance of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and is also collaborating with another company called Map Science. It also produces another vaccine called Gamaleya, but it's another agreement with a company, Richmond, plus a investigation institute. The fact is that Argentina has been able to benefit from the existence of a big manufacturer that costed $40 million that was already working in the production of antibodies, biosimilars, and other generics. And there's also Colombia that is participating within a general framework program by COVAX. Sigue.
Sí, gracias. Creo que solo me quedan 2 minutos, entonces creo que más que la traducción prefiero que se basen en las diapositivas. Preguntaban que si la traducción se puede hacer en otro canal, pero entiendo que no se puede hacer simultánea por una razón técnica. En contraste, Colombia no puede producir vacunas porque tiene menos tradición científica y tecnológica, menos inversión pública y privada, y porque se ha dedicado en los últimos 10 años a conceder más patentes, más rápido, más fácil a más cosas. Eso ha limitado la libertad de operación y hace que aquí no se puedan hacer ciertos genéricos o ciertos biosimilares que sí puede hacer Argentina o Brasil. Eso no le pasa solo a Colombia, puede que en alguna medida esto también le haya pasado en cierto grado a Perú o a Chile, sin perjuicio de las particularidades o las especificidades de cada país. Por poner un ejemplo, en Colombia y en otros países no tuvieron patentes las tecnologías de RNA recombinante y de PCR, y en cambio en Colombia incluso y en otros países de Latinoamérica sí tienen patentes técnicas de edición genética sobre CRISPR, o herramientas de CAR-T, herramientas de RNA mensajero, herramientas de RNA interferencia, y eso cada vez más pues reduce la libertad de operación. Sin embargo, a pesar de eso, Colombia y Chile no están indecisos o no apoyan el waiver, a pesar de no tener capacidades de fabricación, a pesar de haber tenido problemas de escasez. Colombia ya mañana o el lunes llegará posiblemente, infortunadamente, a los 100.000 fallecidos. Ayer fallecieron 590 personas en nuestro país. En contraste, los países que tienen capacidad industrial en Latinoamérica, Argentina, se apoya el waiver, México también. Sin embargo, el hecho de que Colombia, Perú, Chile, Ecuador no tengan capacidad de fabricación no es una razón para no apoyar el waiver, sino por el contrario, debería ser una razón para apoyarlo. ¿Sí? Porque así ellos no pueden fabricar las vacunas, eso va a aumentar la disponibilidad global y va a hacer que haya menos escasez y que se pueda acceder más oportunamente a las vacunas. Ya para ir cerrando, la próxima semana o el 29 de junio se va a discutir este tema en los órganos de la Comunidad Andina por iniciativa de Bolivia. Bolivia es uno de los países de la Comunidad Andina o es el país de la Comunidad Andina que más decididamente ha apoyado Waiver. Los otros países han estado un poco ambivalentes sobre el tema. Sobra decir que el Waiver pues tiene soporte de más de 100 premios Nobel en diferentes áreas, de líderes religiosos, líderes científicos. No alcanzo a explicar que en el caso de Colombia también hay evidencia empírica de que las licencias obligatorias, si bien pueden servir en otros casos, como decía el profesor Correa, en el caso colombiano se han intentado 3 veces y son complejas, hay muchas presiones internacionales. A Colombia la amenazaron, como decía Felipe, con no apoyar el proceso de paz, con demandas de arbitraje de inversión y etcétera. Y digamos que las licencias obligatorias para una pandemia, estas proporciones claramente no son la solución. Si alguien quiere profundizar en estos casos, pues ahí está la evidencia empírica. Y si uno hace un análisis de las otras figuras, tampoco parecen adecuadas y eso explica que tengamos el waiver. Ya creo que me queda un minuto. Hay otro mito y es que no hay patentes.
Yo tengo que traducir porque si no es mucho que traducir.
Sí.
So I was saying that Colombia has less industrial power, for example, than Argentina that I mentioned earlier. So it's a country that has been buying lots of patents. But then Peru and Chile also are in the same situation compared to Argentina. But for example, Colombia, even though it has not patent, it does not have patents for a series of things such as the PCR, the IRN type of technology, but other countries do have it. And that's why Colombia seems to be undecisive on whether to support the waiver. On the other hand, you have other more industrial countries that have been supporting the waiver, such as Argentina. But then you have other countries, Colombia, Peru, Chile. We think that they should be supporting the waiver given their situation, because if they support it, that would help increase the offer that the world is asking for. But we know also that there is a meeting of the Andean countries, amongst which Bolivia. There is a discussion that will be going on June the 29th. And I think these countries should be supporting the waiver. But at the same time, there's discussions on why this country has supported the peace process, the political peace process in Colombia. So there's a connection with this and the ability of these countries to support or not the waiver.
Sí, ya para cerrar, decía, hay varias patentes o solicitudes de patente en trámite en la región o solicitudes PST sobre la tecnología. Si alguien le interesa, puede profundizar en un Patent Landscape que publicó recientemente MEDSPAL. Aunque es incompleto, no es exhaustivo, como decía el profesor Correa, puede haber otras solicitudes que todavía no hayan sido publicadas que afecten la libertad de operación. En esencia sería eso. Voy ahora sí como a cerrar. Otro ejemplo de esa capacidad industrial de Argentina, de Brasil, de Cuba, de México es para una enfermedad que es la fibrosis quística, que también tiene un tema pulmonar. Hay pacientes ingleses que viajan desde Inglaterra a Argentina a comprar un medicamento, porque en Inglaterra es escaso, no se consigue, vale 100.000 libras esterlinas. En cambio, en Argentina vale 20.000 libras esterlinas. Y digamos que ese es un ejemplo práctico, real, que muestra cómo los países del sur global o cualquier país que tenga la capacidad puede ayudar a aumentar la producción y a su vez eso puede hacer que haya más acceso oportuno a medicamentos y a vacunas a bajos costos. Otros ejemplos de medicamentos que pueda hacer posiblemente Brasil y Argentina, que no pueda hacer Colombia o Chile por criterios laxos de patentes o por otras razones. Para la hepatitis C, Argentina y Brasil pudieron hacer sofosbuvir genérico gracias a que no había tantas patentes, había más libertad de operación. En Colombia una universidad quiso hacerlo, la Universidad de Antioquia, pero no podía porque Colombia concedió cerca de 2 docenas, 24 patentes a esos medicamentos y solo a sofosbuvir como 6 o 7 patentes. Hay ahí en la diapositiva otros medicamentos para los cuales Argentina, Brasil tienen libertad de operación y otros países del sur global no la tienen. Creo que sería todo y creo que dejaría hasta ahí para no extenderme en el tiempo y más bien dejamos por si hay algún tema de las preguntas. Hay una paradoja con Colombia y ya con esto cierro, y es que Colombia copreside COVAX, Colombia es copresidente de COVAX, el ministro de Salud de Colombia, y no apoya el waiver. En cambio, Francia, que copreside el COVAX, parece que sí apoya el waiver. Y perdón si soy repetitivo con la idea, Argentina, México anunció que lo anunciaba, que tienen capacidad de producción, apoyan el waiver, y en cambio Colombia no, y creo que pues es un error, hay razones jurídicas, éticas, económicas, empíricas, políticas, sobre todo de salud pública y sobre todo de razones humanitarias que son suficientes para apoyar el waiver, y también hay una base legal suficiente en el artículo 9 del acuerdo de Marrakech. Algunas personas dicen es que lo del waiver no está en el ATIC, sí, no está en el ATIC, pero está en el acuerdo de Marrakech, en el artículo 9, que también es un tratado internacional vinculante. Lo que ese argumento sugiere, pues, es una ignorancia grande del derecho internacional público y privado y de cómo funciona la Organización Mundial del Comercio. Pero creo que recapitulando lo dejaría ahí. Siempre va a surgir, si hay unos retos importantes en el waiver, y es que se logre negociar rápido y que haya un acuerdo rápido sobre cuál va a ser el ámbito o el alcance y de cómo se va a dar la implementación regional. En el caso de la comunidad andina, los países de pronto no tienen tan claro, a pesar del waiver, qué pasaría con la decisión andina 486. Y creo que generar seguridad, generar tranquilidad jurídica o facilitar esos procesos de implementación nacional ayudaría a que más países se sumen al waiver. Hay una interpretación prejudicial del Tribunal de Justicia de la Comunidad Andina. Infortunadamente, es positivo que se haya pronunciado. Infortunadamente es un tanto restrictiva. Vamos a ver qué pasa en este encuentro de la Comunidad Andina del 29 de junio con el liderazgo de Bolivia, con los cambios políticos en Perú, y ojalá que el hecho de que Colombia supere esta barrera tristemente de los 100,000 fallecidos, pues haga ver que circunstancias excepcionales merecen medidas excepcionales. Creo que lo dejo hasta ahí. Gracias. Excusas por extenderme en el tiempo y por las dificultades con la traducción y demás. Gracias.
I was saying that there are some patent requests going on right now in Latin America, but some of them have not been published yet. Anyway, I'd like to just give you this example in terms of industrial capacities of a certain number of countries, such as Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, or Mexico. You know that, for example, for some type of diseases, such as the cystic fibrosis, there are lots of English people going to Latin America where they can buy the local medicine manufactured in Latin America for £20,000 instead of £100,000 in the UK. So there are clear examples by which we see that southern countries from the big south, if I may say so, can be instrumental in the increasing of capacities worldwide and improving the access to medicine in general. There are other examples of Brazil and Argentina for the C. hepatitis where these countries have been able to come up with a generic contrary to Colombia. But there are other examples where countries have more operations freedom, if I may say so. Brazil and Argentina, they're more able to come up with local medicines and generics. The strange thing about what is going on right now is that you know that Colombia is co-chairing the COVAX, and Colombia doesn't seem to be supporting the waiver, but France, that chairs the COVAX, supports it. Or at least it seems so. You have countries such as Argentina and Mexico that are supporting the waiver, but Colombia not. I guess there may be, of course, legal, economic, ethic, humanitarian reasons that would go for the yes, the supporting the waiver, and certainly others that may go for the no. There's also the Article 9 of the Treaty of Marrakesh. You know that there is some kind of a misunderstanding. At least some people may say that the waiver is not part of the TRIPS agreement, but we also know that this is covered in the Treaty of Marrakesh. So clearly there are some challenges going on, the ability to come up with a quick agreement and being able to implement it regionally. There's also the Andine 4.86 article that has to do with legal security. There was a question, a prejudicial question sent to the court in Bolivia asking about the legal consequences of such a waiver, but we don't know the result yet. Peru also may be in the same situation, and other countries too. So I tried to summarize as much as I could quickly because I know that we do not have so much time allocated to each one of these speakers. So thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thanks. Many thanks, Professor Lizarazo, and thank you to the translator as well. I think despite the consecutive translation, the presentation was clear. It was a very useful presentation linking the productive capacity of different countries in Latin America, and particularly Colombia, to intellectual property rights, and as well as to the position that these countries take on the issue of the TRIPS waiver. And particularly the example of Argentina, I think raises an issue of further possibilities of technical cooperation between Latin American countries. If we could set up a system of regional cooperation whereby certain countries could perhaps become hubs, Argentina, Brazil, maybe Cuba, for export of vaccines and other goods to other countries, or even can help increase the productive capacities of countries that lack these capacities. And for the purposes of this event, how could the TRIPS waiver contribute to those initiatives? Well, without further ado, let me give the floor to our next speaker, which is Dr. Mayda Mauri from Cuba. Dr. Mauri, are you with us?
No, she has not joined. She has not joined. So you can go next speaker.
She has not joined?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll go to the next speaker, which is from Brazil, Professor Henrique Zeferino de Menezes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, André. Well, first, I'd like to say that it's a glad of being here and share this table with colleagues and important reference for me in the global debate on intellectual property rights and public health. As critical aspects of the debate have already been addressed in previous presentations, I'd like to bring to the discussion here a slightly different perspective on the importance of the South American and Latin America countries in supporting the TRIPS waiver proposal. In fact, I want to focus my speech on a political and institutional dimension of regional governance and health, and how this global mobilization around the Waiver proposal can be something as a trigger for countries in our region to put back health at the center of regional governance and at the center of our international cooperation agenda. I think something that you are already talking about. I'd like to focus somehow in this aspect. Of course, it's clear that the urgency to respond to the health crisis with the acquisition and production of safe and effective vaccines, dose of vaccines to ensure quickly immunization of the population must guide the actions and the strategies of national governments right now, especially in the context of strong inequality in access to vaccines, the lower rates of immunization in the countries in the global south, the crisis of COVAX facility, all this despite the recently adopted declarations and resolutions that defined immunization against COVID-19 as a global public good. However, I think it's possible to think of responses in the longer term, which also consider the need to strengthen regional governance mechanisms in health, and the convergence between government, civil society against in this debate, in the mobilization of these actors in this global debate. So in this case, I think there are two questions or two aspects of this debate that seems relevant. The first one, it's the need, as I said, to strengthen the institutional mechanisms of governance and cooperation in health in the region, in our region, which were severely weakened by the crisis of the Union of South America nations, sorry, which had very quickly developed a critical expertise in matters of health cooperation, gained an important international role in multilateral debates, including on the debate on intellectual property rights and access to medicines. And a second critical issue that is more directly related to the potential effects of the waiver concerns the possibility of stimulating the absorption of knowledge and technologies related to the development and production of vaccines and medicines and other medical technologies for the structuring of a more integrated production infrastructure in the health industry in South America and Latin America. And also to think how to design some policies and institutions for the acquisition of technologies and products for our healthcare systems. Well, of course, these are problems, but there are also solutions that naturally will require some political change and some realignments in the regions, which has been suffering from a political crisis for years. And it's also suffering a process of disintegration of our regional arrangements that was built in the last decades. And again, I think UNASUR is a clear example of how these changes is affecting our capacity to respond to this health crisis. But also, I think the history of UNASUR and especially the Health Council of UNASUR can help us to put together different perspectives and learn from the past and think and look to the future, future responses to this kind of crisis. So the creation of UNASUR back in 2008, and especially the Health Council, as I said, represented somehow an important and a critical change in the direction of the regional integration in South America, a kind of social term that expanded the cooperation agenda much further or far from being merely an integration between markets. And this process of the creation of UNASUR and the council, the Health Council, placed cooperation in health and health policies and health systems as a central aspect of the regional cooperation. And health was seen as a tool for economic and social development, and also a frame for a more active and proposeful international insertion of the bloc in different multilateral forums. So for this, UNASUR built an intra-regional cooperation agenda, building of new ideas and consensus on health and new cooperation and collaborative practices between the countries in several areas connected to health issues, such as vigilance and responses in health, development of universal health systems, promotion of health and its social determinants, the development and management of human resources, and access to medicines. Well, so in this case, access to medicines and also of the barriers to access, especially intellectual property rights, they were critical issues for South America countries, for UNASUR, and became part of a joint, several joint manifestations in different international forums. UNASUR started building common positions in international negotiations, but also started working together in the definition of strategies and policies for negotiation with pharmaceutical companies in the purchase of drugs. So in several occasions since the creation of UNASUR, countries have managed to define joint positions in multilateral forums, presenting proposal of resolutions or focusing on different international negotiations in a more active and proposeful manner. One case that it's really well reported by the literature of this UNASUR's performance in the field of health governance, of health cooperation, was in 2012 World Health Assembly, when Ecuador and Argentina presented a proposal to replace the controversial international medical products anti-counterfeiting task force and substitute it for a different international or intergovernmental group. Another important feature of UNASUR health governance was the search for some degree of regional autonomy in health matters. And it was critically to think and plan the development of local productive capacities, strengthening the coordination of local productive capacities for the production of medicines and generic and other health technologies. So in this sense, UNASUR started some programs to share information on capabilities to development, production of medicines, health supplies, understanding that only with the strengthening of local capacities or capabilities, it would be possible to reduce health inequalities, to propose a local development policy and gain some comparative advantages for international developments. Other policies and strategies for access to medicines were addressed regionally as well. And one of them that I think it's quite interesting was the establishment of a program to share information on prices of medicines purchased, to avoid over exploitation by pharmaceutical companies, and the definition of joint negotiations to procurement of drugs, to try to have greater bargain power with pharmaceutical companies. So this is a very recent past in our region. Today, of course, things have changed, but I think it brings some important lessons about international cooperation in health, and it brings also some elements to understand the importance of the current debate on the waiver of the TRIPS waiver proposal. In addition to highlight the importance of a coordinated agenda by the countries in the regions with the political reorganization of a bloc of countries that are they're active, in this subject. As was mentioned today, Brazil cannot assume part of the leadership in this process, as it has always done. I hope it will be able to do this very soon again. But other countries have better conditions for this today, as Argentina was mentioned, Cuba, of course, because of this industrial capacity and and Cuba solidarity in this matter, this historical solidarity of Cuba in the health aspects. But also, of course, the civil society organizations, including Brazilians that have an important history of working in this field. So we can look to the future with these lessons in mind, I think. And first, obviously, the TRIPS waiver, I think, would put the world in a better condition, especially for countries in the global south, to accelerate their immunization policies. It's too long overdue by vaccine shortage, high concentrations of those sales to high-income countries. As was mentioned as well, South America is far from to achieve herd immunization, with less than 10% of the population full immunized. And it's important also to politically to resume the political dialogue and the political convergence to build joint positions that represent the most urgent interests of the countries in the region, and the strategic interests of the region within the cooperation agenda in health and access to medicines, and also to strengthening the regional health infrastructure and health surveillance mechanisms, which were much better used in other times during other cases, other pandemics. And finally, I think we must think how to encourage local technology capacitation through the absorption of technologies, development of technical capacities, political coordination, and the building of a regional infrastructure to strengthen the pharmaceutical and the chemical and biological industry in the region. As we know, some companies and institutes here in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Cuba are already operating in the production of active pharmaceutical ingredients and manufacturing vaccines for COVID-19. So the incorporation of technology should be a strategic goal at this time, and also looking to strengthen the coordination and collaboration between countries and companies and public institutes in the region. So I'm reaching my 15 minutes, so I will end here, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you for bringing the political element to our debate. Indeed, the institutions that before Latin American countries could count on to influence global health governance are no longer there. Now, and you mentioned UNASUR, and the South American Health Council, those were very critical regional institutions that these countries could rely on to build coalitions, which, for instance, could now be used in the ambit of the WTO, but were before used in the ambit of the WHO, and also to negotiate and to reach common positions on issues which are critical in health emergencies, such as the one we're undergoing. And these institutions are no longer there, as UNASUR has collapsed. But thank you again for bringing this issue to the table. Let me turn to our last speaker, which is from the South Center as well, Viviana Muñoz Tellez. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andre. And let me just check that you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I have the pleasure to follow these excellent speakers before me. So I'll try to be short on points. I agree with much that has been said prior. So back into the big question again on the waiver and its role, I think it's been well explained that the key role of the waiver is ensuring that potential manufacturers will have more capacity to experiment, more freedom to operate. So overcoming these IP barriers by establishing this temporary suspension of intellectual property only for this context, which is very particular, and understanding that these products are necessary to address a global pandemic, then it seems that this should be something that would benefit globally. And it is not an answer or an anti-intellectual property proposal. It is a health-based proposal that is considering what are the roles that intellectual property plays, but also how to ensure that the balance which the IP system must provide is also respected. So of course, we're also very supportive, as Professor Correa has priorly said, as an institution and personally in our work. Then in terms of looking specifically at the waiver impact in the Latin America context, as others have said, it means more options for procurement. So it has been mentioned that in Latin America, many countries depend on imports mainly for sources for diagnostics as well for medicines and vaccines. And we have seen this in the COVID-19 context as well, with, of course, outstanding exceptions that have been mentioned. Innovative vaccine production coming out already in stage 3 in Cuba, substantial efforts in Brazil, capacities in Argentina through partnerships already with the standing vaccine manufacturers and others. But if we look at the whole of Latin America, there has been this reliance historically on imports for health products. For most countries, which has also led policymakers away from attention to this industry from a public health perspective. And it has also allowed a much more a closeness in terms of the strength of the negotiation position by pharmaceutical companies since we have this gap in the region. So as others have mentioned, this is the context, though, to understand some of the reluctance for the IP waiver, also because many countries that are still struggling to have access to vaccines, because we have this huge gap in terms and delays in the vaccination campaigns in Latin America, then of course this also pushes some reluctance towards the IP waiver. So again, we also agree that this is a misguided policy. We consider that this is the historic moment to go forward with important reflections and reforms, not only with regards to the public health sector, but also with regards to the R&D model and the R&D structure, just as our previous presenter has clearly described the importance of having the strong R&D system and the adequate ecosystem for innovation, where we see that there has been this high focus on the intellectual property as an element of the innovation ecosystem, but it has forgotten about these other important and perhaps even more substantial incentives that need to be given for innovation, including strengthening regional cooperations overall, which are not necessarily IP as the main element, but really through substantial funding, opportunities for academics, for exchanges, and so much more that can be done by government in addition to having a strong position with regards to intellectual property protection. So again, if IP waiver is not the solution to the full problems of vaccine equity, it clearly will support expanding production capacities. And for countries that are not able to produce locally, it still will expand those global production capacities, which will benefit the options for procurement. Now, the question also arises because if vaccine producers were amply extending non-exclusive licensing to all the potential manufacturers who are demanding these, then and also sharing the know-how for vaccine production, then we wouldn't be questioning why we need to address these issues within the IP system. But clearly, we see that the voluntary licensing system has failed us, and it will fail us again in the pandemic situations. So vaccine producers are not extending licenses to potential manufacturers. We saw many examples also with Professor Lizarazo's presentation. And so therefore, the potential manufacturers have a very high risk of potential infringement, which would lead to substantive litigation. And this is the game in the IP world for the big players. Litigation on IP matters. This happens extensively with pharmaceuticals, but in the case of smaller firms, particularly if you think of the context of Latin America, it's too challenging, it's too risky to go forward if you don't have real certainty that you will be able to operate. So this is why the voluntary license mechanism is definitely not sufficient to address this barrier. Now, with regards to the use of compulsory license, this has already been addressed in the sense that, for example, the European Union is posing the compulsory license slight modifications or discussions as an option to the TRIPS waiver. Now, here, clearly, this has already been explained by others that the failures of using the compulsory license system for this pandemic situation are very clear. These require case by case. They can be quite lengthy to determine. For example, many countries in the Latin American context, there's not the regulatory framework for implementing compulsory license is very unclear. So it's very hard even to know what is the process, and the procedures can be quite complex and can take very long time. So therefore, in this context, the compulsory license system will have a limited effect in terms of what we want to do in terms of time of speeding up access and production. And of course, in Latin America, we have a historical pressure for not issuing compulsory licenses, as was also explained in many examples, including Professor Lizarazo with Colombia, which had tried for several years and has had several examples where it was very clear that there was no desire to license by the company, and regardless of that, there was a clear public interest. Well, this was not possible to do. And there's other tools that also need to be used, for example, competition law, to counter the potential anti-competitive practices by using IP abusively to delay or block competition. But unfortunately, in the Latin American context as well, we're way behind in using competition law in this way. So the issue is that we do have TRIPS flexibilities that are extremely useful. They are very important to elaborate on them. But in this case, where we are in the pandemic situation, this will not be sufficient. So it will not be enough for Latin American countries to focus on implementation of TRIPS flexibilities at this stage. There's a lot of work to be done. But therefore, the TRIPS waiver also offers an opportunity much more swift to address this issue by simply saying we're temporarily suspending these rights. It does not apply only to patents, it also applies to trade secrets and others, therefore giving a lot more confidence in the environment for potential producers to operate. Now, the other point I'd like to make is that the IP waiver, in addition to helping to expand vaccine production, it will also produce positive externalities. And some of these have already been mentioned by our speakers. So, for example, it will bring attention to the problems of the dearth of research and development in the sector and the misfunctioning of the IP system as an incentive tool. So while we see many Latin American countries with strong IP protection as a policy, we don't see R&D levels going higher, or a lot of focus on this being a policy that has contributed substantially to increase research and development. So clearly it will put attention again to how do we incentivize research and development in this important sector without such focus only on IP protection. Now, another is that it will also bring attention to the need to improve the frameworks for the use of TRIPS flexibilities. At the international level, that's already clear. even at the EU counter-proposal to the TRIPS waiver, refers to the limitations of the compulsory license system of the TRIPS agreement. So clearly there's work to be done to improve the TRIPS flexibilities as established under the TRIPS agreement, and also then at national level, the frameworks for implementing those, making them much more simple procedures and guidance for more swift use, in particular for compulsory licenses. And this is one area which South Center provides technical assistance and is always happy to provide developing countries upon request. Now, also, it will open the door for consideration of other necessary reforms. Very importantly, in Latin America, many countries need to apply more robust standards to determine whether to grant patents in the pharmaceutical sector. So in examining whether a patent a patent application complies with the basic criteria of novelty, inventive step, and industrial application, this is a very strong tool that countries have in order to avoid having a number of patents that should not be granted in the first place, then becoming barriers for other producers and also for collaborations to take place. And finally, also the need to improve the incentive systems overall for research and development and for rewards, even for academics, through grants, through increased funding, through promotion of collaborations to bring in new knowledge and technology to allow for experimentation. Consider again the role of reverse engineering versus only considering imports of technology which cannot be used unless there's substantial know-how transfer from abroad. So there is a need to focus on more types of these policies rather than this narrow approach that has been taken in many of our countries, unfortunately. And so with that, I'd like to end my intervention for now to leave some space for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Viviana, for keeping to the time and above all for a very clear and powerful presentation exposing the position of the South Center. As you showed, the TRIPS flexibilities are not sufficient, and that's why we need the TRIPS waiver. Compulsory licensing, voluntary licensing have not produced the effects that are necessary to help us undergo this health emergency. And they have several limitations as well. And thank you also for pointing out what you call the positive externalities of the TRIPS waiver, which is something that I consider very important, and not just the most immediate or direct effects, but positive spin-overs that can happen over time, and that can, as you put it, help to promote R&D, help to promote competition, and perhaps even greater collaboration between our countries. And finally, also an important point that you raised, and I think this is something that's very misunderstood by the press and by the media, is that the waiver is not a proposal against intellectual property across the board. Right? It is something that's a lot more limited and restrained than that. It applies during a certain period of time and for certain measures that are within TRIPS, and that seek to make it more balanced, particularly in this circumstance of a pandemic, of a health emergency. And with that, let me thank the speakers for their interesting presentations and open the floor to the audience and to those who would like to pose questions to our speakers. And will we do that by the Q&A field in the platform? Or
yeah, you can ask the
will we do it by the chat?
Panelists can read them. Panelists can answer them. The questions are in the chat box for you. Like what vaccines will be the best target for compulsory licensing to have more cost research in providing the vaccine?
Thank you, Ravi. So the question has already been read by Luis Villarroel. Would any of our speakers like to address this question? Which is the only one I see thus far. Yes, Viviana, please.
I'd like to make a point on interesting question. I mean, one of the limitations of the compulsory license solution is that you need to have a very good picture of what is the patent landscape. In this case, compulsory license can only be done for patents, so you won't get access, for example, to secret information through it. So we're focusing on patents. Now, you need to do a proper patent landscape, and in the case of many of these vaccine technologies, in particular new ones like mRNA, it's very difficult to know what is the geographical coverage where those patent applicants have been applied. Even those that have been done through the PCT system, there is, of course, a delay in publishing. And therefore, that already creates problems in determining it's not just one compulsory license you will need, it's probably many that are necessary. So ideally, what you would want is to be able to have a way to ensure that that product you're trying to produce you will have a complete picture of what are all the patent applications. So as an example, BioLease, the Canadian company that was requesting Johnson & Johnson for their vaccine technology to be licensed, but was not able to get this license, they asked BioLease, when they asked for the license, to provide all the patents that they had been applied for in Canada in order to have a complete picture, and then to allow the license to cover all of these while paying 5% royalty rates. But Johnson & Johnson did not even respond and was interested in licensing. They went then to the Canadian government to ask for the compulsory license to be able to produce for poor countries, which one of them is Bolivia is interested in purchasing through the system. But that has gotten stuck. But the point here again is to say that to look at targets for a compulsory license, you have to look at the full product. You don't necessarily, I think, need to focus on the most innovative technology, mRNA. It would be important also to consider what are the production capacities of the manufacturer, and we see that there's many that are efficient. It does not have to be the higher level end, but you do need to get access to that adequate patent landscape. And it's unfortunate that institutions like WIPO are not doing a job in helping get a very clear patent landscape done when they could with their resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else care to comment on this question? Okay, we still have 10 minutes. Do we have other questions? I don't see any, and I assume that people have to write their questions, right? Because they're not visible.
What vaccine would be the best target for compulsory licensing to have a more fast incentive in providing the vaccine?
But that was a question already addressed, no?
Yeah, that's the only question we have.
Well, while we don't have additional questions, would any of the speakers like to comment on other presentations that were made, or any other issues you'd like to raise?
I have a quick comment, if I may. I think the momentum around the waiver, it's somehow creating different possibilities also for countries to improve their own national legislations. When it comes to compulsory license in particular, we know that since last year, many countries have updated their legislations to facilitate the use of compulsory license. And this is, I see as a positive outcome of the result is that IP laws are becoming more adapted to address the public health needs. And for example, in the case of Brazil, there is an ongoing discussion about how to improve the patent law in the compulsory licensed articles. And the proposals are in a way reflecting the spirit of the waiver, because one, they are trying to create a compulsory license mechanism in Brazil that covers a lot of technologies at once and a lot of patents at once, and also that includes patent applications in the scope of compulsory license, because it's something that in many countries you need to have a granted patent in order to start the compulsory license procedure. So the reforms now in Brazil are trying to put patent applications also in the scope of compulsory license to create a mechanism in which many patents and many technologies are covered in one single act. And also there are now some language to make sure that companies are obliged to share their know-how And if they don't share, the regulatory agency can share the know-how that they hold through the regulatory dossier. So I think that's the kind of innovation that we also want to see across the world, also to rebalance the existing system. I totally agree with Viviana that this is a moment also for us to think of different forms of incentives, different ways of organizing our research and development system. But inside the patent system, we also feel that there are many imbalances, and many of those imbalances are resulting from years of pharmaceutical companies lobbying governments, lobbying legislators. So now there is a turn back. There is a change in Brazil, for example, also in the Supreme Court. We have seen recently a ruling that removed from Brazil patent term extensions. That was a very harmful measure adopted back in the 90s in Brazil. So this kind of reforms are also helping to create more balance in the IP system. And in the case of this compulsory license reform that is going on in Brazil, it also, in a way, touches the trade secrets when we think about the obligations around know-how sharing or the role that the regulatory agencies can play in sharing this information that should be, it's treated as non-disclosed information. There are data protection clauses that must be followed by countries, but considering the emergency, the health emergency, the public interest, this somehow countries can also think ways of overcoming and sharing the knowledge, so to make sure that more producers can come in and that people don't lack access.
Thank you, Felipe. So that could be considered even yet another positive externality from the waiver if it helps us or leads us to improve our own legislations in the matter. And thank you for bringing the new developments in Brazil in that respect as well, and particularly the Supreme Court decision. We have additional questions here now in the box. Mr. Balakrishnan asks, can we have alternative mechanisms to TRIPS for rewards for invention based on health impact, for example? And I think this is an issue that has been touched tangentially by our presenters. Luis Villarreal also asks, what would be the generic producer to reach? And I assume this is posed in the ambit of, in the context of a compulsory licensing decision, right? If we had a compulsory license, what would be the generic producer? So anyone would like to jump in and tackle this question?
I think that there is also a question on what role could Mexico, NAFTA, Bolivia, Andean Community, Argentina, and other countries play to build consensus around the waiver?
Thank you for that. Yes. So yeah, this was a translated question. Yeah, and Mexico, Bolivia, Argentina, and other countries play to build consensus around the waiver.
Well,
go ahead.
Go, André.
Yes, please.
I think regarding this alternative mechanisms to TRIPS, I'm not sure if this kind of arrangement looking for rewards for inventions would be the best options for a globally response or a globally institution or mechanism to foster innovation. Maybe in some countries they can try to look for some kind of arrangements like this, but I think globally maybe it's time again to put back on the table the debate on the abiding agreement for R&D funding for some disease, not for only for neglected disease that was being discussed in the past, but also for the R&D for the development and the production and viability of vaccines in the case of pandemics. Well, in the case of Mexico, Alianza del Pacífico, NAFTA, I think there is some structural political problem in the region that it's making it difficult to arrange some kind of commitment between countries. the lack of institutional mechanisms to dialogue, to put these problems at the table. Different perspectives from countries in the region about this proposal specifically. It's quite clear when we look to the Brazilian case. We are here facing some terrible times in our foreign policy, in our some kinds of political dialogue with our neighbors. But yes, I think one of the solutions for the region is to put this difference apart and try to work together in some solutions that can sustain global responses like the Waiver, but also look to the region as a place for us to increase our capacities to respond to crises like this in the future.
There is another question from Luis Villarroel regarding investment treaties or BITs, bilateral investment treaties.
Yeah, perhaps I could give a try to some of the questions. First one I wanted to address was with regards to the role of certain countries in promoting the waiver in the region. So I think, yes, we've heard from Bolivia, Argentina as strong promoters, a bit less from Mexico. But I think Bolivia, I mean, recently partnered to support the president in making this call in a high-level event. There is the Horas con Who mechanism as well that's trying through that to gather more general support from the Andean community. And I do agree that that eSalud no longer standing is as unfortunate because it would have been a mechanism where a lot of this had advanced. But I think some of those efforts are being made and necessary to do more. Argentina was a standout at the World Health Assembly recently as well among Latin America, supporting the waiver as well as in the fair pricing policies. So I think the call out is more to the other countries to perhaps join more or listening more to those messages or the rationale behind and try to seek more mechanisms at high level discussions for advancing this from a regional perspective. And on the other point with regards to investment treaty implications of the waiver, this is something that South Center has been holding expert consultations, and we've had several webinars on this. And one of the issues that we consider would be important is to perhaps have a reference to this as something that should be made an exception within the waiver that is being negotiated now. So that directly it would say that this waiver would apply with regards to those investment agreements, even the countries that might hold them bilaterally. So that is something that's proposed, although this would need more detailed attention in terms of what are the particular bilateral investment agreements that different countries have, and then consider what is those implications on a case by case. But this is something that countries need to think about, is how to implement the waiver at national level. It's not something that cannot be done. It simply requires attention now to ensure that the waiver can be implemented once it's agreed on the negotiation. That's all on my side. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if there are no further questions, André, you can just see, whether you want to have each speaker last 1 minute, or you can just wind it up as you please, and I will propose a vote of thanks.
Can hear you, André.
I guess I was muted for a long time. My apologies. I was just saying, I was thanking Viviana for her answer and just saying that regarding the question on investment treaties, Brazil hasn't engaged in any of these. So this is not an issue for Brazil in particular, but I understand it is for other countries and an important one. So I was saying with that, we have reached the time, and I would like to looking forward to Dr. Ravi Srinivas for his final remarks and for closing the event. And I thank you once again for a very fruitful and rich discussion. To all the speakers.
Thank you,
and
André.
those who...
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Since people are joining from different time zones, I just warmly thank them for attending this webinar and then for showing interest in it. First of all, I would like to thank RAS DG, Dr. Professor Satya for his support. Unfortunately, he could not join us today, but he was very keen to participate. He could, but he'll be following it up. I thank Dr. Balakrishnan for his support and for giving the welcome remarks. I thank Professor Correa for his excellent welcome remarks. And this is the third webinar we are in which he is speaking. And every webinar he is giving us new points. It's obvious that in South Center and RAS we have a lot of things in common, and we can definitely do things together. Dr. André is an old friend of RAS, and he's also one of our members in the NEST, which is the Network of Southern Think Tanks. So it's our pleasure to have him in our meetings, particularly on which relate to IP. And he conducted the proceedings very efficiently. Thank you, André, for bringing new insights as well as even points into it. Then I should thank Felipe Carvalho, who has to leave in between now for some urgent work. I thank you for making certain things very clear, particularly the Brazilian context and how the situation is in Latin America. Then Professor Oscar Corte made a very interesting presentation that really showed us how the situation is evolving, but it is still becoming very complicated in the sense that we do not seem to be moving towards a consensus, but still some steps are being done. So I hope that, from a lot of things which we need to pick up from his presentation. And Dr. Henrique Menezes also made a very important point, particularly when that comes to the political economy side of the TRIPS waiver and then the scope for countries collaborating and then the real issues that come up regarding vaccine manufacturing, distribution and all. So the point is that from a Latin American perspective or from an African perspective or from a general perspective, we see there are a lot of common issues as well as common approaches, but then we need to consolidate them together as something like a strategic plan and a strategy that can take us forward. And Dr. Viviana also made some very interesting points and comments, particularly she made some of the points which have been made in the Publication South Center. I fully agree with her because this is not an issue where we can simply say that compulsory licensing is fine, TRIPS vaccines are good, we can manage with that. It's not so. So I think all the four speakers today brought a very nuanced understanding that reflects the regional position, the regional, the issues and then the challenges which we wanted to discuss, as well as how the regional countries are trying to cope up with by either working through registrations or by negotiating with manufacturers or through collaborating among each other. And then it is also very clear that the TRIPS-based and the text-based negotiations, they may proceed in some direction, but then there are also a lot of other issues like the EU trying to put its own bar so that the negotiation do not go the way we want. So to sum up, this is the third webinar which we are having, and this has brought into sharp focus some of the which key things we need to really pursue with greater, more bigger, and with much more cooperation. And at this stage, I would like to thank Samir Fakar for his excellent translation that really helped us, although there were some technical issues because the WebEx does allow only one-way translation, that is from English to Spanish or not the other way. Maybe I think the developing countries now should develop a platform that allows translation in both ways, at least so that we do not depend upon these platforms as the sole support for us. In fact, Samir brought in a lot of clarity in the translation, and that really helped us to understand the nuances as well. I would like to thank Sushma Bhatt and Soumya Raja of the RI's technical team for their excellent support. They have been supporting us systematically and methodically in organizing webinars. This is the third webinar we are doing in this series, and without any technical glitch, we have been able to do it. So I thank them once again for it. And then RI's social media team is actually very active and very putting a lot of efforts in putting these messages and then social media across. They are not just tweeting, but they are also in Facebook and then they are also in YouTube Live. So I thank them for their excellent support. I thank once again all for your kind support and then for participating in this. This is the third webinar which we are doing. The fourth one is due next week. We will shortly be announcing the details about it. Thank you all once again. Good evening, good night, take care. Thank you, bye.
you. Bye.